and this chump ain't no different. He'll fall an inch to prove that I'm great. And if he keeps talking jive, I'm going to cut it to 5.
Those words have become absolutely iconic, and they're still etched in the minds of so many people, even though they were proclaimed nearly 60 years ago, believe it or not. If you were alive to hear those words when they were spoken, I am the greatest. I love the last part of that. He keeps talking jive is what he says. I'm going to knock him out is what he says. We've coined a phrase, or better yet, an acronym in our own day, particularly when it comes to the world of sports. We talk, or at least so-called experts and authorities talk frequently about the GOAT, right? What's that stand for? Who is the greatest of all time? There we go. Thank you, Nathaniel. Somebody's participating, all right? The greatest of all time, and we sit and have endless discussions about. Many in basketball would ask, who is the GOAT really? Is it LeBron? Is it Kobe? Is it Jordan? I'm particular. Man, I grew up a Bulls fan. There nobody will be surpassing Jordan ever. How about football? Is it Montana? Is it Brady? Is it Manning? Is it somebody else? Baseball? Is it Ruth? Is it Mantle? Is it some young superstar today? If sports aren't your flavor, we do the very same thing in entertainment, don't we, right? Who's the greatest actor or actress of all time? Is it De Niro or Hanks or DiCaprio? Is it Streep, Hepburn or Mirren or Kidman? Is it a singer? We do with singers, right? Is it Dion? Is it Presley? Jackson or Houston? Music group, song, movie, food, restaurant. We do it all day long, don't we? We have our opinions. While we may have some very strong opinions about what greatness means, who is, what is the greatest, and where it's found in our world today, we create a standard for greatness in our life, a self-created standard, a worldly standard. Jesus' take on it gives us a really good idea that greatness in God's kingdom is not what we would expect. Greatness in God's kingdom is not what we often make it in this world. It's not what we usually strive for, display in our lives. If you pick up almost any leadership book, and I know that probably most all of you are just wanting to devour leadership books every single day of your life. I'm a nerd, I do, all right? You pick up almost any book on leadership and you are presented with the steps or the formula for achieving greatness. Climbing the ladder of success. This is what you need to do X, Y, Z, and you will be great. And while success and achievement is not inherently bad or wrong, I don't want you to hear that this morning. You feel like we're not supposed to achieve anything. We're not supposed to be ambitious. That's not what I'm saying. It's not inherently bad or wrong. We have to ask ourselves constantly what the ultimate cost is when we pursue greatness over arguably one of the greatest kingdom ethics that I think we have, and that is service. I'm here to serve you. I want nothing more than to serve you. I want nothing more than your best or your greatest. Simply, guys, our definition of greatness and achievement must be different from that of the world around us. Jesus teaches us that true greatness is only achieved by serving others first and foremost and asking, this would be a great question, by the way. It's not a rhetorical question. It's a question I think would be great for us to ask every single day of our lives. What can I do for you? What can we do for the other person to prefer them and to elevate and to lift them up above ourselves? And just as it is today, people in Jesus' own day wanted to know what true greatness looked like. But there's a difference between appearing great in the eyes of others and being truly great in God's kingdom and by His standards. And the passage that we're going to read today, Gary's already read it. It serves us well to read it over again and then just to walk through it and take a look at some things. Jesus' own disciples, I want you to notice that, by the way. Jesus' own disciples who followed him around all of the time were very confused about what it takes to be great in God's kingdom. So if you think that you and I struggle with it, if you think the world struggles with what it means to be great, we shouldn't be very surprised if those closest to Jesus were just like, I'm not sure I really get it either. Matthew chapter 20 again, if you have your Bibles, open them up. It'll be up here on the screen. There's a Bible in front of you in the pew, or you can pull it up on your device. We're going to be in Matthew 20 today, and particularly just 8 verses. Then the mother, and I just want you to put yourself in the scenario, like you are sitting there on the day that this happens, and just take all of this in. The mother of James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus with her sons, and she knelt respectfully to ask a favor. I want something of you, Jesus. What is your request? What do you want? He asked. She replied, in your kingdom. By the way, just catch this. She has a belief that Jesus will come to reign and rule fully and finally in a kingdom that has been set up for him. So she's got that mindset. In your kingdom, please let my 2 sons, my good little boys, Jimmy and Johnny, sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right hand and one on your left. We understand this, right? Culturally, what that represented. It still represents somewhat the same thing in our own day, right? For you to be in proximity to a person who has power and authority, what do you automatically get? Power and authority. Right and left. We're here as like the big dogs next to the big dog, all right? The vice presidents next to the president. But Jesus answered them by saying, you have no idea what you're asking, do you? Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering that I'm about to drink? And just like, I can almost imagine like, oh yes, we are able. We can do this. Really, guys? Yeah, we can do that. Jesus told them, you guys will indeed drink from my bitter cup. You see, James was the first martyr of the early church. Records tell us and history tells us he was beheaded by Herod Agrippa. John would be the longest living apostle. He would go through many trials in his life. One of them, I know this is a bad day, by the way, being boiled in a pot of oil. And for some reason, that guy didn't get crispy. And they pulled him out. And like, what's worse than that but being exiled on the island of Patmos, which most of the time we just say that he was exiled on an island. You're like, I don't know. I could be exiled on an island right now and it sounds pretty great. This was a horrible, horrible island. Essentially what John was exiled to was a work camp. It was a mining island. They mined for ore. And John in his elderly age would have been forced into brutal, brutal labor every single day. Records have that he may have lasted all the way until about 95, 98 years old. Could you imagine that? Eddie, your birthday, when's your birthday? Yesterday. 101, folks, by the way, all right? Eddie, would you like to be on an island and be mining for ore? No, Eddie's like immediately, no. None of us, doesn't matter for 101 or for 10. Nobody wants to be doing that. That's what he's talking about. You guys will experience this, but just not right now, and not in the way that I'm going to. But more importantly, what he says here in verse 23 is, my Father, I have no right to say who will sit on my right and my left, because my Father has prepared those places for the ones he has chosen. Now, when the other 10 disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. Now, I think that's probably a pretty polite word there, indignant. It sounds so sophisticated, mad, right? I'm indignant with you. They were ticked off. They wanted to get at James and John and probably punch them square in the face. But Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people and officials and flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must become your slave. You see, actually, Jesus will teach this about 3 different times between the end of chapter 19 and all the way through chapter 20. He's trying to get something across. This is the ethic that I want you to live by in my kingdom. First last, last first. For even the Son of Man came to be served, or not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many. You see, at the heart of this story in Matthew is a head-on collision between what Jesus is trying to explain, what their trip to Jerusalem will entail, and what they assume that it's going to be. Jesus knows that he is going to go and die a very brutal and horrible in way that they're anticipating. They are convinced that Jesus is, or at least Jesus should be, following their agenda. Jesus, we want you to do things the way that we think they should play out. And they cannot possibly comprehend the repeated warnings from Jesus that it's all going to be very different from what they imagine. If you look back into chapter 20 here, just before what we read here, I want to read verses 17 through 19. I'm not sure if it's on the screen or not there, Nathaniel. As Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside privately, and he told them what was going to happen. Listen, he said, we're going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die. They will sentence me to die. And this is the first time that Jesus tells them how he's going to die. They will hand him over to the Romans to be mocked, flogged with a whip, and crucified. But on the third day, he will be raised from the dead. Now, if your leader had told you this is what's going to happen, don't you think you'd have some questions? But what in the world do these guys immediately begin to do? Yeah, that's good, Jesus, but who's going to be the greatest? Like, I think I'm the greatest, Jesus. And one moment he is talking to his disciples about the terrible things that are going to happen to him in Jerusalem, including the torture that he's going to have to suffer. And in the very next moment, Mommy Dearest comes onto the scene with her two sons of thunder. That's what James and John were often called. Do you wonder why they might have been called sons of thunder? Because they were impetuous in every single thing that they did. Jesus, do you think, like, they're not listening to you, Jesus? Should we just call down like fire from heaven and burn these suckers, is what they say in one point. Jesus is like, guys, you're not getting this. Stop. They are always doing dumb stuff like that and dumb stuff like Jesus. Who could we be the greatest? Could we be right around you? And they butt their way into this conversation. Jesus saying, I'm going to die for you guys. And they're like, that's okay. But who's going to be great? James and John come with the bright idea, brokered by their mom, that since Jesus will be sitting on a throne in his kingdom, why don't we just commandeer a position on either side of him, to his right and to his left, solidifying their position of importance and greatness. Guys, this is really no more than an example of power brokering. We see it every day in our world. Jockeying for position. James and John feel that if they can align themselves with someone of great stature like Jesus, their tickets are punched to the Hall of Fame of Faith. We've got a great ride all the way to the end. They don't get it, do they? You see, where in the world did James and John get this idea from of thrones and ruling and greatness? It came actually at the end of Matthew chapter 19. If you have your Bibles open, and you look back there, I just want to read one verse, Matthew 19:28, and it says this. Jesus replied, Peter has come to Jesus. He said, Jesus, we've given up so much stuff to go and follow you around in our lives. What in the world are we going to get to be paid back? What's our reward? Jesus says, I assure you that when the world is made new at the end of all things and the Son of Man sits upon his glorious throne, you who have been my followers will also sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So it's not like these guys and their mom are just pulling weird stuff out of nowhere. Jesus has promised there will be thrones. You will be on the thrones. The thrones are already assured for them, leaving only the question of precedence. Who's going to be the greatest? At least in their own mind. That's how they conjure all of this up. And by the way, I think you guys know this already, but I want to press on this. This is not the first time, nor will it be the last time that the disciples asked this question of Jesus. Let me read some scriptures here. The first one, Luke chapter 9. Verses 46 through 48. Then his disciples began actively arguing amongst each other about which of them was going to be the greatest. But Jesus knew their thoughts. He knew exactly what they were talking about. And so he brought a little child to his side. And he said, anyone who welcomes a child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me also welcomes my Father who sent me. And then he says this famous phrase again. Whoever is the least among you is what? They are the greatest. Do you hear that? It's turning everything on its head and upside down and inside out. Least become the greatest. Mark chapter 9, he continues, and this is another moment. They arrived at Capernaum, Jesus kind of home base for his ministry, and they settled in a house, and Jesus asked, I love this, by the way, you ever have like your mom and dad, they know exactly what you've been discussing? They have like radar ears that can hear anything. Jesus asked his disciples, hey, boys, what are you talking about on the road out there? Do you ever have that sinking feeling when you've been found out? Oh, they didn't answer. Because they had been arguing again on a second occasion about which one of them was the greatest. And he begins to teach again about calling them over. And again, here's this phrase again, whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else. And then in probably one of the most confusing points of Jesus' ministry that you would think that they would like tune into what he had to say, they are at the Last Supper. Jesus is hours away from being tried and tortured and crucified. And seems to be in the context, if you go to John 13, Jesus does what in John 13? He gets down and he does what? He washes feet. And he begins to institute the Lord's Supper that we celebrate. And he says, this is my body broken for you. This is my blood given and shed for you. And then what does it say here in verse 24 of Luke 22? Then they began to argue amongst themselves about who would be the greatest. Oh, really? I mean, what is the motivation constantly behind this request of Jesus, tell us who is going to be the greatest? Peter thinks it's going to be him, but we don't think it's him, Jesus. We actually think it's going to be us. We understand, right? There's an inner circle that did very really exist within Jesus' 12 disciples of Peter, James, and John. And it seems to be here that James and John are like, we just kind of need to cut Peter out of this, and it needs to be just the two of us. We can make... They didn't actually sing that. I promise you that they did not do that. I mean, was it totally unreasonable to ask? Because Jesus had promised, I will have a throne, and you guys will be on 12 thrones ruling with me. Is it something that we would be tempted to ask in our own lives? Actually, if you look at it and you kind of remove yourself from it for a little bit, it actually makes perfect sense that a mother would come to ask for something for her boys, right? Every one of us has a mama, right? All right? And probably at some point in life, that mama wanted to protect you like you were her little baby hen, and she wanted to do everything she could to ensure the best for you. And she comes with a request that would make a mother proud and the sons very, very happy. One commentator says it this way. This woman, the mother, was a regular member of the disciple group. We know that because later she shows up at the foot of the cross as Jesus is dying and he's being crucified and he's dying. And so she was a regular part of the disciple group who accompanied Jesus in much of his ministry. So her involvement in her son's ambitious ideas is hardly surprising. I remember the day very well in my own life. I was a freshman in high school, and I was on my spring break band trip down to Florida and to Disney World. And this is really embarrassing to admit, but I'm going to do this morning, just be vulnerable, lay it all out there. I was in my hotel room, and my mom thought that she always constantly needed to do mom things, right? Like she's the mom that we like, getting all this stuff over. She was in my hotel room, and she was actively fixing my hair. Now, I know that's really surprising. You're laughing. I did have hair at one point in my life, and it was actually pretty awesome, all right? 6th grade, I had a mullet. Not just a mullet. It was a purr mullet, all right? But I didn't have that at this time. I just had like awesome spiked hair from like the 90s. My mom was sitting in the hotel room, in the bathroom, and she was combing my hair and hairspraying it. And that's not really the most embarrassing part. The most embarrassing part was here came all of my friends walking by the hotel room, and they stopped in their tracks and they looked in the room and they're like, what in the world are you doing? I'm like, my mom's doing my hair. At that very moment in my life, I realized it was no longer cool for my mom to do my hair. And so from that point forward, she never did my hair. But my mom was the mom who James and John's mom is. I got to do everything to. I remember I was a senior at Indiana State, and I was in the School of Education. I wanted to be a teacher when I graduated. And long story short, I took a test that you have to get your credentials and license, and they had just, like, as I took the test, they shifted the standards and said, now we're going to go on new standards. I would have passed it under the old standards, but I didn't under the new standards. You know what my mom did? Mommy dearest. She wrote a letter to the dean of the School of Education. That would be bad enough. She also wrote a letter to the president of the entire university and said, my little boy needs to graduate, so give him his diploma. I was embarrassed. I was mortified. You know what these guys here in the story are? They're not mortified at all. They're actually proud. Ambitious they are. Mom's ambitious. This mom, her name is Salome. We know that because, again, we just trace the story. She shows up at the cross. That is their mom, the wife of Zebedee. She comes respectfully to Jesus, doesn't she, right? It says it in the text. She assumes a posture of worship and she bows before Jesus. But her motive in all of this becomes very apparent very quickly, doesn't it? She speaks. She isn't coming to give Jesus anything, but she's coming to ask for something from him, isn't she? Almost like, like on Aladdin when you rub the genie lamp. I get 3 wishes. That's how people treat Jesus often. And Salome does that. And again, I want to say this very clearly. It's not that ambition is bad. But poorly motivated ambition is bad. Believe it or not, and I want you to hear this because I don't think most people get this, because we think God's just a meanie and he just wants us to suffer and be miserable. No, he doesn't, actually. Let me say this, and I want you to hear this. Jesus wants you to be great. But you might have to take a different approach than you had planned to get to greatness. A very different approach. Actually, an approach that will involve testing and trial and suffering. In fact, the great missionary to India, William Carey, said it this way: attempt great things for God, and you can expect great things from God. In the end, James, John, and Mommy Dearest had no earthly idea what they were asking for. Jesus says as much in verse 22, doesn't he? He says it very plainly. Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. Boys and girls, do you ever have a time in your life where you feel like you request something of God, and God gives you an answer back, and he says, you don't know what you're asking, do you? We often don't know what we're asking. We're just talking. Maybe James and John were thoroughly convinced that they had earned the right to sit on those thrones, in those seats. And if so, what was James and John's definition of greatness? Guys, it's the same way that the world still defines greatness. How? How does the world define greatness today? How is it different from the greatness that Jesus talks about? And I believe it all comes down to this: whether it was James and John or it's the world we live in today, greatness is often defined by self-grandeur, self-service, selfishness, instead of what Jesus is talking about, which is sacrificial service, selflessness. And perhaps that's what made the other 10 so upset. After all, what in the world gave James and John the right to think that they were better, or that they were more loved, or that they were the greatest of all time? Why in the world does it say here the disciples in verse 24, the disciples, when they heard James and John ask that, were indignant? Why were they so ticked off? Guys, they were ticked off because they were angry with James and John for jumping the gun and trying to get a leg up. Is that possible? That's why they're mad? I actually would take it a step further. I would submit to you that I think the reason that they are so ticked off is because what? They didn't think to ask first. Like, Shoot, I've been thinking about that every single night. I've been thinking about coming to Jesus and asking who's the greatest. And there you go, James and John. You had to get yourself to the front of the line, didn't you? They wanted to guarantee their own greatness. It was their own ambition that drove their displeasure. It was their jealousy that motivated their judgment of the two brothers. Their anger arose from their own aspiration for preference and for privilege and for promotion. Commentator N.T. Wright says it this way: when the other disciples became cross, I love that word, cross with James and John, it's probably not because they were so pure-minded, but simply because James and John got to them, or to Jesus first. Guys, I want you to think for a moment. Can you imagine the number of requests for something that Jesus had to deal with daily? Every single day, people pressing in on him. Heal me, heal my son, heal my daughter, do this, do that. I want something from you. Guys, it had to be exhausting and demanding, right? Like if you have kids, you know a small fraction of it. If you have a 5-year-old home who has red hair and her name's Brylan, you know what it means to constantly be demanded of something. I want it. And yet, this is what really amazes me about Jesus. He never seemed to be frustrated with people or to be put off by people. Actually, as people were asking, I want, me, demanding things from him for much of his life and much of his ministry, do you know what Jesus did? He gave them way more than they asked for, actually. Because you understand, in the end, he gave himself, all of himself. Whatever people asked, Jesus says, I can always go one more. And that's what I want you to notice initially about this moment here in Matthew chapter 20, is that Jesus, not just here, but in all of his ministry, Jesus seeks to serve even when everything else tries to get in the way. Jesus never makes the excuse, I'm too busy, I got too much going on, too much demand on my life, you're not really getting it here, are you? You're asking who's going to be the greatest, I'm telling you I'm going to die. He says, I'm going to serve no matter what tries to detract or distract me, I'm going to serve you. And what we think in our life oftentimes, guys, is I'm going to serve when it suits me. I'm going to serve and love others when I'm ready. I'm going to serve and love when I'm built up enough. Like, what does that even mean, really, by the way? Built up enough. When are you built up enough that you're ready to do something for God and for Jesus? Jesus, again, had just laid out the most unthinkable, horrible, brutal admission that he's going to suffer. And then here comes Mama asking for something in a very self-serving way. And what does Jesus do? Does he go off on her? Does he go like, do you get this, woman? What does he say? What does he do? How can I serve you? What's your request? What are you asking for? That's what Jesus says. That's how he responds to people who are just wanting to use him for something. What do we often do in our lives? Oh, I know, I can see your motive. I know what you're about to do here. I know what you want from me, and you just want to use me. And so we just snub people. Jesus never did that. The compulsion to be served and have everything served up to us and for these guys is completely contrary to the way Jesus operated in his life and ministry. You see, Jesus didn't expect others to serve him, but he looked for ways to serve them. He taught them, he healed them, he pointed them to the kingdom of God, and this is the amazing thing, all without expecting anything in return. Do you know what Jesus really asked? He said, I will give you everything. I will give you eternity. And what does Jesus ask for from us? That you would just have faith. It seems so comically small, doesn't it? True, genuine, heart-changing faith, and I'll give you eternity. Guys, wouldn't this world be a lot more like the kingdom? I don't need anything from you, but I want to give everything to you. Guys, people like that stick out. People like that are different. because they are so few and far between. It was an ancient Chinese philosopher that said it this way: the highest type of ruler, or I would say the highest and the greatest person, is the one of whose existence the people are barely aware. D.L. Moody, a preacher, said, "We may easily be too big for God to use, but we are never too small." And that's why, guys, I think Matthew 20 is the perfect bookend to this series that we've been talking about in February, because it returns to a topic we talked about in week 1, right? Remember we talked in week 1 about humility, lowering ourselves, taking the low place. It takes that, and what Jesus teaches here on Matthew 20 expands upon that idea of humility. So what in the world, as we look at this and we start to walk through this here, what does Matthew really want to show us? What does he want us to see through the life and the example and the words of Jesus Christ? And I think the first thing is what we've been talking a little bit about, but I want to keep working on this, is that Matthew wants to show us our desire to be an insider. We all want to be an insider, don't we? And we will scratch and we will claw and we will do whatever it takes to be on the inside. These 12 guys, James and John in particular, look to be, at least on the surface, the ultimate insiders, aren't they? They're 12 guys who constantly travel around with Jesus. These 12 apostles have spent countless hours, days, weeks, months, and by this time nearly 3+ years with the Master. And so surely you would think these guys will have it all together. They've got this all figured out to a T. But truth be told, and it's shown right here in Matthew 20, these guys are just as big of a mess as anybody else. They are constantly and they are completely missing the kingdom ethic of sacrificial service. And most notably, they were driven by the central aim to prioritize themselves, as all humanity is prone to do. You see, this is really like a bad reality TV show. You know, shows like Big Brother and shows like Survivor, where I do anything to win. At all costs, I will win. Every man or woman for themselves. All bets are off as a conniving scheme to be the last one standing. And it's, guys, our desire to reach the pinnacle at all costs that ultimately ruins relationships. And that's what happens here in Matthew 20, doesn't it? When it says the disciples, all the other 10 of them were indignant. They were ticked off. That's the erosion of a relationship between these guys. C.S. Lewis, many years ago, wrote an essay that was entitled The Inner Ring. And he says this: "I believe that in all men's lives at certain periods, and many periods, between infancy and extreme old age, one of the most dominant elements is the desire to be inside the ring, and the terror that comes at the prospect of being left outside." Guys, the inner ring is not inherently evil. There are just in society rings in different levels, and they are pretty neutral most of the time. They're pretty amoral. But when it comes at the cost and the expense of other people, that's when the inner ring becomes very, very sick. C.S. Lewis continues, "The quest of the inner ring," listen to this, "will break your hearts unless you break it." The world seems to be full of insides, and we often desire to enter into those inside inner rings and inner circles. But if we follow that desire, we will reach no inside that is worth reaching. The true road lies in quite another direction. The direction that Jesus will lay out here in Matthew chapter 20. In all of his ministry, that's the direction that Jesus wants his guys to go. Matthew also wants us to grasp, it's not that we want to just be the insider, but this is really truly the heart of everything here in this chapter. Matthew wants us to grasp Jesus' desire for us to become an outsider. Verses 25 through 27, again, that's what he teaches. "You know, the rulers of this world lord it over you. They flaunt their authority. And among you guys, though, it says it will be different. It must be different. Who wants to be a leader? servant. Who wants to be first, last, must be a slave. Guys, Jesus gives a different way. He gives a new way and a different way to be human. Because this insider mindset is exactly the thing that Jesus wants to change in his followers. This natural human concern with status and importance is one of the most fundamental instincts that must be unlearned by those who belong to God's kingdom. You see, what makes someone great in the kingdom of God is the exact opposite of worldly ways and thoughts. To become an outsider in this world, you become an insider in the world to come, in eternity, in God's kingdom. The greatest are the lowest. They are servants, someone who seeks not to get, but to give. They are called and they become slaves, not only to Christ, but to other people. Someone whose life is not their own, the furthest thing from the inner ring of society. Jesus wants to snuff out, he wants to stamp out all traces of an insider mindset and to have us begin craving giving ourselves away. Guys, the clear takeaway, do not miss this. If you don't get anything else, get this right here. The clear takeaway is that in God's kingdom, whoever would be a leader, who would ever be the chief person, who would ever be the first person, the word that is used here in Greek is the word protos. It's the word we get for and we use for prototype. Whoever wants to be the protos among you must be your slave, is what he says, which is the word doulos in Greek. Whoever wants to be great must be a servant, a minister. It will sometimes be translated because it's the word there in Greek, diakonos. It's where we get our word deacon. Deacon simply means nothing more than a servant or a minister. To become last. The final thing that I think that Matthew wants us to grasp a hold of here as he comes towards the end of his gospel is that Jesus reveals how we change. Do you want to change in your life? Jesus tells us this is where change comes. We alone have no idea. It is so important that we hold on to the gospel because what Jesus tells them is that he will make the way. He will make the way for them to have the power to move from the inside and to become an outsider. As Jesus himself became the ultimate outsider, didn't he? He drank the cup of suffering that was meant for us, that we could never handle drinking on our own. And in this, Jesus comes to serve humanity, taking our place. Everything in Jesus Christ. Amen? Guys, that is just straight gospel truth. It is the hope that we have. And when Jesus became the ultimate outsider, guys, it literally tore him to shreds. And it put him in a grave. But it made us whole by the truth and the power of his resurrection. Paul would say in Romans chapter 6, verse 10, when Jesus died, he died once to break the power of sin. But now that he lives, and because of us being attached to him, we live for the glory of God. Guys, Jesus didn't seek to get anything, but he only sought to give everything, even to the point of death. When we trust what Jesus has done to serve us, only then are we free and empowered to serve others freely. That's why so many times in your life that you say, I want to serve people. I want to serve people with everything that I have, and we try to do it in our own power. It never lasts, and it never really is effective. Because we're trying to do it our way, and in our power, and in our smarts. when we accept what Jesus has done to serve us, that's when we truly begin to serve other people. We serve because Jesus served first, because he went first. And guys, not only has he gone first, Jesus keeps going. He didn't just stop when he was on a cross and when he raised from the dead. He said, all right, guys, I'm out of here. The job's done. I have nothing else to do. Do you know what it says? That Jesus today is actually in heaven right now at the right hand of the Father, and he's doing what? He is interceding for us on our behalf. He keeps on going and keeps serving. He will never stop serving. Guys, we are served every moment of life by Jesus, and when we realize that, we lift high the name of Jesus by serving others. We don't do it for moralistic and altruistic purposes and because we want to just love. Because our service towards others demonstrates Jesus' immense sacrifice for us. You guys ever heard this phrase before, and maybe you said it yourself? You know what? No, like, you have to take care of yourself before you care for others, right? You have to make sure that you've got yourself in good order before you serve other people. Aren't you stinking glad that Jesus didn't have the same mindset? I'm Jesus, and I'm the Son of God. And so I really just need to kind of worry about me, and then I can serve. No, he never did that. He instead came to serve and to save at the utter detriment and destruction of himself. I would say it this way: we model Jesus' ethic and we model Jesus' life when we spend ourselves to serve others. Exhaust ourselves to serve other people. Guys, this is the glory of the gospel. Not just that Jesus died to express a loving sentiment towards you, although that is true, John 3:16. But the glory of the gospel is that he did that, and he went through that, and he suffered that instead of you. That's the truest form of service. And he says as much elsewhere in the Gospels. John 15:13, he says these famous words, right? There is no greater love, there is no greater service than to lay down one's life for one's friends. See, it is all about love, but it's love in a very different way than we usually see it and the way we usually practice it. And guys, because of all of these truths, ultimately Jesus has come to show us how to truly live, how to be completely different, to be citizens of a kingdom that is not of this world. It's really interesting if you go all the way back to the Old Testament, into the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 14, there is this interchange that happens. It seems very weird when you read it. Many scholars and commentators believe that it's actually a conversation between God himself and none other than Satan. And it says this in Isaiah 14, "For you said to yourself," this is God speaking to Satan, who was once an angel in God's kingdom. "You said to yourself, Satan, I will ascend to heaven and I will set my throne above God's stars." What was Satan really saying? I am the greatest. I will preside on the mountain of the gods far away in the north. I will climb to the highest heavens, and I will be like the Most High. That was Satan's downfall. He wanted a higher position than one that he had, and he was cast out of heaven. But Jesus, here comes Jesus, down to this world. He served personally. I want to focus just in the last few minutes here on verse 28, and that's it. Jesus served this world personally. Even the Son of Man, what's that word that comes after that? Came. Lowered himself, condescended from the heights of heaven to the hell of this world. He left the convenience of heaven to come to the chaos of this world. The reason Jesus can say any of what he says in his ministry, and specifically here in Matthew 20, is that he has gone first. Because Jesus took the lowest place here, he will receive the highest honor in all eternity. Jesus didn't just serve personally, he served selflessly. He came not to be served, but to serve others. He did everything that he did for the other. Guys, the greatest gift that God can and did give is Himself. And even in sharing His glory and His magnificence with us, that is the most selfless thing that God could do. He doesn't have to do that. He doesn't have to pull back the veil and let us see, this is my glory, this is my goodness. Be in awe of this. But He did that, and He does that constantly because He delights in sharing it with us. I heard this line this week, and it was so very true. Most people will look at Jesus' incarnation, coming to this world and taking on human flesh, and they're like, you know what? That's really beneath Jesus, isn't it, right? To become a man? It is. The incarnation is beneath Jesus, but He did it anyways. Guys, let me in on a little hint and a little secret. If nothing is beneath Jesus, guess what? Nothing is too low or beneath you doing. Jesus served personally and selflessly. Lastly, He served specifically, and I would call it missionally. He was always on mission to give His life a ransom for many. That's the mission. Why did Jesus come to this earth? There it is right there. He didn't come to love or to heal or to do miracles or to teach or any of the other things that people often attach to Jesus. He came specifically to set captives free from sin by paying the highest price. Guys, most humans by nature, you and I, we live transactionally. I give you something, I do something, I expect you to give me something back. Oftentimes we expect people to give something back that's of greater value than we've given to them. And if you don't, then all bets are off. I cut you off. Guys, most people act out of their own self-interest and purely what benefits them, often taking advantage of people's goodness and generosity without even considering giving some of that back, let alone the heaping helpings of what we should be giving back because of what we have been given. Let me ask you this question, real question. Think about it. Dwell on it the rest of the day. Is it easy for you to serve other people? And probably every one of you that are sitting there is saying, well, yeah. I mean, I'm a really horrible person if I say no to that. Is it easy for you to serve other people? Let me restate it and add something else to it. Is it easy for you to serve others who are not like you? Is it easy for you to serve others who don't think like you? Is it easy for you to serve other people who are actively opposed to you? Now it just changed, didn't it? Like, well, I don't know anymore. I'm not really certain if I really am all that into serving people. Jesus was. Jesus led out. He set the standard. He blazed a different trail. So my friends, go and do likewise. Serve personally. Serve selflessly. Serve on purpose. Serve in love because Jesus went first. Guys, we simply must be different than this world, as Jesus was by leading through serving others. Guys, this is sacrificial service, to serve even and especially when it hurts without expecting anything in return. To spend ourselves in preferring others and lifting people up. That truly is a way of life that is best of all, as Paul would say it. Who is the greatest? In the end, I think as we've seen today, it's the person who can find a way to become the lowest. Where are you in your life in relation to your standing in the kingdom? Do you find yourself constantly saying, I am the greatest? Now, we wouldn't say that out loud, right? Because that's just arrogant. And people don't like arrogant people. But in our actions, in the way that we live our lives, we often give off that air. I am the greatest. That is beneath me. I don't do that. I don't serve there. I don't serve in that way. Jesus did. I'll do two things this morning. One, very, very pointedly. If you're in this room this morning and you don't know Jesus and you've never put your faith in Jesus to make Him the Lord and the Savior of your life, you're never, ever going to be able to get to what I just talked about this morning. Try as hard as you want to be a really good person and to really love people, you're missing the biggest part of the equation, to love God first and foremost. And if you're in here and you're not doing that, you should probably have a conversation this morning with somebody before you leave this place. You should probably be prayed over. You should probably have a conversation. And for the rest of us who feel like, hey, I'm in Christ, I'm following Christ, are you doing that in the best way that's possible through His power and His glory and His grace? That as you understand, I think sometimes we use this word grace and we don't fully grasp what it is. And if you've lost the glory of grace in your life, maybe you need to return back to that so you can understand that, because what Jesus has done for us, we do for anybody and everybody else. Would you guys stand with me this morning as we close in a word of prayer and the worship team comes back up here to lead us in singing through worship?